The most important consideration when designing and creating a software system is ensuring that the data in the database isn't lost. We're going to explore TypeORM both in development and production, and we're going to ensure that our data survives container restarts. When working in development, we want a nice, easy workflow. Any changes to our code or entities which represent our tables in the Postgres database, we want those to be reflected immediately. However, in production, we don't want this. We don't want any potential data loss, and we want to use migrations, and we're going to use TypeORM migrations to ensure that there are no data loss associated with updating the database. We're going to see both how to do this in development and then also in production. Let's start off by looking at some simple API requests and how TypeORM automatically generates the entities and also synchronizes the database. So this will be how we would normally want to set up our development environment. So let's start by, firstly, let's open up our environment variables. And when we're creating entities in TypeORM, we didn't connect to this in the previous video, but it turns out that, as one of our subscribers pointed out, that this URI here needs to be PostgresQL here. So let's just go ahead and just save that. And then we can go into our app controller. So in our API folder, we can come into the source folder here, and we can open up the app controller. And we can see that we've got this simple GET request here at the moment. So what we want to do is we want to also have a post request, because we want to just simply post a little bit of data and then generate a table in the database. Okay, so let's just change this to the post annotation, and then we'll import this in from NestJS common. And then rather than this get user method, we'll have a post user method here. And what we'll do is we'll return this auth service, and then we'll send, and then we'll have this command here, and we'll have it go to the post user. And actually, while we're here, let's change this to get users, so we can get all of the users from the table. And then this get user can be the command get users. So let's just go ahead and save that. So this is our API gateway. So of course, we're going to need to be able to handle this from our auth controller. So if we open up the auth folder and open up the controller here, we can delete this get here, but we can go ahead and we can just change this command here to get users, and we will need to create a service for this. So let's go into the auth service here, and let's start to build that out. So we're actually going to need an entity, because if you're familiar with TypeORM, basically you need to be able to communicate from the database and match all of the columns in the database table to the code. And the way that gets mapped through TypeORM is using an entity and injecting a repository. So I'm just going to do it in here for now. This is just to demonstrate how we can develop in development and also in production. We'll see that later on. So we just want to get our environment set up nicely, and then we'll come back to refactoring the code in another video. So an entity is typically has a dot entity at the end of the file name, and it's essentially a model. So basically what we can do here is we can use TypeORM because it has a annotation entity, and then you can also name the entity. So here we've got a user, and we're just going to do a simple user here. So we can just go ahead and we can export our class, and we're going to call this the user entity. And we want to have an ID, which is a number. And we also want to have a name, which is a string. So we're going to change this, obviously, in the next video when we set up authentication. We're going to have more variables, emails, passwords, and all that. Oh, I think it was just a prettier thing and an unrecognized word, so just ignore that. Never mind. So basically, what we want to do here is using TypeORM, they have annotations on each of the columns. So for example, the ID, this is going to be a special annotation because that's going to be the unique identifier that automatically gets generated when you create a resource or a row in the table. So whenever a user is added to the table, we can have this primary generated column, and that will just ensure that the IDs get incremented correctly. So if you've already got one that has an ID of 1 and 2 and 3, for example, then it will just go to the 4th ID and automatically put that there. So we don't have to put that in ourselves. And then we just got a standard column here, and we can just go ahead and save that, and Pretty will reformat that for us there. So now we have this entity. We're able to map between the database table, which hasn't been created yet, but we'll see how that gets generated shortly, and then also our code. So we can start to work on that in the auth service here. So let's just delete this hello boilerplate stuff here. And what we want to do is we want to inject the repository in the constructor. So we can do that by using this @inject repository method that comes from NestJS TypeORM. And that's going to take our entity. So we just created a user entity here. And then we can assign that. We only want to use it inside of this service. So we can have a private read-only variable. And I'm just going to call this the user repository, which is going to be of the type user repository. Oh, sorry. It's going to be of the type repository, which is coming from ORM, TypeORM. And then we can put in the user entity there to make it the user entity repository, or simply the user repository. And then we can end the constructor there. And let's just go ahead and put our Nest variables up the top here. So we just organize that a little nicer. Have third-party ones here, and then also have our stuff in here. So we've injected the user entity. Now we can just have a simple function here. So we're going to need to access the database. So we can have a function here, an asynchronous function, and we'll just call this get users to match the controller. And then we can have a return, which is going to be this user repository, and find. So that's just going to find all of our users that are in the database in that table. So we can go ahead and we can save that. And then I'm going to have another method here. So this is all pretty simple stuff so far. If you're lost at all on what's happening in this video, please check out my LinkedIn clone video series because it explains this in a lot more detail. But this is just the prelude to finding why we'd want migrations and the problem with synchronization. But right now we just need to focus on setting up our development. So we'll just create some simple CRUD methods here. We'll have a post one here. And we can just go ahead and we can return this .user repository. And then we can go ahead and we can save. And we don't need to put the ID in because that's auto-generated. So if we look at our user entity, right now we've just got this name here. So we can just go ahead and we can just have a name here. And then let's just call this guy Larry. So it's all pretty simple so far. we just made a simple entity, and we've used the repository that we've injected to communicate from the database back into our code and map those two together. So now that we've got that sorted, we can close this now, and we can also close our user entity and our package.json file. Okay, let's just write the method out. So we got the message pattern, and we want this to be the command here for posting a user. And this is going to be in a sync method, which we post the user. So let's just write that there. So this is going to take the context here, the RabbitMQ context, because recall that it's going to go to the, it's going to go from the API gateway to the message broker, and then the message broker is going to have some of its own context. So let's just go ahead and add that in there. I think it's just erroring because we haven't used it. But if we just copy this here, we can just get something basic going here like that. And rather than return this hard-coded value, now we can just go ahead and we can return the auth service. But we need to, of course, inject that. So just below here, we can create a constructor, and it's going to take the auth service, which is of course of the type auth service, which will give us access to the auth service. And then we can go ahead and we can just get the users. We can save that. And likewise, we can go ahead and we can call the, so let's just actually step into that. So we've got this post user here as well, where we've just hard coded this value. Again, we're going to come back to this, but this is just to demonstrate development. So let's just go ahead and copy that method name. So here, rather than return this, we can return this.auth service .post user. And then we can go ahead and we can save that. So let's come back to our auth module. So we can just go ahead and close that and close that. And actually we can close this as well. But let's just open up our auth module. So our auth module, if you recall, we've set this up in the previous video where we've made the database connection. And then we're doing it on the URI. And recall, we've just updated that to have the PostgreSQL in the part of the URI there. But we commented out, we briefly talked about these two here. And basically what auto-load entities does, it searches through your entire application, and anything that's an entity, so any class that has this @entity annotation on it, it will find that and then it will use that. So we can actually just use this auto-load entities to easily find all of our entities. You could also do it manually or based on a file path or on something like that, but I think it's sufficient if we just use the auto-load entities here. And then I've also got this synchronize true thing here. And it has this caveat where it says we should not be using this in production because we may lose some data. So I want to actually demonstrate this and why this is important. So let's just go ahead and we'll just save that. And we can actually start to just run our code right now. So let's just open up the command line. And let's just run a docker compose up. And then we'll just wait for that to load. Now, one thing to note while that's loading is in our Docker Compose file, we haven't actually set up any bind mounts for our Postgres database, which means when we turn off the container and turn it back on again, we're actually going to lose the data. So the solution to that is having a bind mount, but I just want to demonstrate like what's actually happening here. So if I come to Postman here, and then I just make a GET request, actually this might take a little while to load. Let's just check our Docker. So we see we need to step into something here just to see if there's any errors or anything like that. Oh, and I think we actually need to add the entity as a provider. So let's just take a step back here. And I believe it's in the auth module. Yeah, that's right. So whenever you make an entity, we can auto load the entities. Now this is where we configure the TypeORM connection, but you could imagine that as our application grows, perhaps we might have different folders that also use the TypeORM configuration and connection. So in addition to this, we can actually also have the specific variables that we want to, the specific entities that we want to load. So let's just have a look at that. I believe what we can do here is we can just specify the entities, and we can just say, okay, we want the user entity, and then we can just bring this in here like that. Then we can save that. So let's have another look. Okay. So Nest can't resolve dependencies of the auth service. Please make sure that the argument user entity repository at index 0 is available. So let's have a look at this. So that was the auth service. We're trying to inject this here, but it's not letting us do that. If we go to the auth module, oh, that's right. We're auto-loading our entities, so that's okay like that. But we need to inject our, for each feature, or each entity, we need to declare that. So actually below this TypeORM module here, we can go ahead and we can have TypeORM module for feature. And then we can go ahead and we can put our user entity here. So we can save that, and we see that we've got that hot reloading set up from last time. And then if we look into our Docker container, we can see that those errors have hopefully gone now. So let's just come back to Postman. And if we make this request, we see that we just get an empty array back. So that's all well and good. So let's try and post something. So let's just post, so we need to make a post request here. And then in the body, actually we don't need a body because it's just simply hard-coded at the moment. So I've posted this, and it's posted an ID 1 of Larry. So let's just post another one. We see we've got the ID of 2 here. And then if we go to get our users, we can see that we've got the ID, name, and Larry here. Okay, so that was just the simple CRUD operations where you connect Postgres to our code through TypeORM. So what we want to do is just demonstrate a problem that we might have. So a problem we might have is if we're in production, and basically we've got this synchronized true thing here. So what that means is when we're just working on our code, so let me just close this terminal for a second. Let's just say I'm in the auth service here, and I want to change this from name to first name, let's say. And we save that, and then we come here, and then we save this to first name. And then I go ahead and save that. If I come into Postman, and I make a GET request, we see that it's automatically changed things to first name. So that might be what you want, but there should be a little bit more, you know, surveillance, let's say, a little bit more, you know, we don't want to just change our code and it automatically changes everything in our production database, because it's going to change the column names. You might accidentally write a variable name, it changes that, and then you're in this state where you've changed some of the real data, or even worse, if you drop a column and you lose the data, or if you add another column and it gets into a corrupt state or something like that, or worst of all is if your data gets lost completely. That's why we don't necessarily, I think it's great to have this while you're developing, and we'll leave it on in development mode, but I do want to just demonstrate how we'll go about you know, having your data persist, and we're going to use migrations to do that. So the thing is though, we're actually in a microservice based NestJS project. So if we open up the project again, and I just start to close a few things. Actually, I might just close a few of these files here. Basically, we can see that if we close, let's just collapse everything. And then let's open up our Nest CLI here. So basically you can see that we're in a mono repo. And basically what that means is when we build our project, and actually we have a dist folder here, it's going to build the separate projects, and it's going to bundle it into just one file here. So the problem with this is TypeORM is sort of independent of NestJS, and it expects that you can make your migrations based off JavaScript files. So we actually need to output the JavaScript files corresponding with the entities and also the migrations. And right now we're using Webpack. That's the default and recommended approach when using microservices. But the problem is that we're not able to, you know, bundle our code out in the format that we want. So we can actually turn this Webpack true, and we can simply, and I might actually do a Docker compose down. So let me just cancel out of this here. Just because I want to make a bunch of changes before running. So if I was to run Docker compose up again, we'll get an empty array because we haven't actually binded our database. So we'll fix that up in a sec as well. But let's just run a Docker compose, down. So all we really want to do here is we just want to change this to false. And now we'll use the TypeScript compiler instead, which will bundle all of our files into, you know, JavaScript code. So we can just go ahead and save that. And that's what we want, because we actually want to use some of the dist files to be able to reference the migrations and entities. So let's actually come back to our Docker compose file. And if we open up the Docker compose file, and we come to the Postgres here, we can actually just say, okay, we want to have some volumes. And the issue we're solving here is persistence of data. So we want to have something on our folder. Basically, we want to have a database folder where all of our data is stored. So let's just have a DB folder here. And then in it, and this probably would have got auto-generated for us, but let's just do this here. So we've got an empty data folder in a database folder. So because we're in the root directory, we can just say, okay, we can go into the database folder and to the data folder, and we can bind that to this location here. So var/lib/postgresql/data, and that's the default location in the Docker container where the data is stored. So what this is going to do is when we close our container, we're going to have all of the stuff bound on our local machine, on our host machine, in addition to it being in the Docker container on reload. So we can keep our data, and also means if anything happens to our container, we'll still have it in our file system. So just a small tweak there, but an important one. So we can also think about our Docker ignore file, for example. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to comment out this dist folder here. And the reason I'm doing this is because we actually want to build our project and use some of the built files for our migrations. So we'll see that in just a moment here. And most of the effort's actually in building the project. So we're going to build it, and then it's going to go over into Docker container. But I'm just going to comment that off temporarily. So next, what we want to do is we probably want to, well, when there's data in here, we're probably going to want to ignore that. So if we come to our git ignore, we can just say db/data, because we want to post our data to the repo. So let's just go ahead and preemptively ignore that. And then we can close that file there. So we want to also start to work on a couple of scripts. And this is where most of the work's going to be happening. But just before we jump into that, let's go into our auth module again. So we can go into our apps, go into our auth module. And in our auth module, we see that we've got this sort of thing here. So what we want to do is we just want to adjust this a little bit. And the reason we want to do this is because what we're doing in this for root async here is we're essentially taking this object here, which is basically the instance of our connection. But when we're doing migrations, we're using TypeORM, but that's not the one that's bundled with NestJS or the wrapper for NestJS. And it actually needs this same instance to be able to perform our migrations. So we do need to make a couple of tweaks here. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and we will move this to its own file. And if you look at the TypeORM migrations, it has actually have a, it's actually called the data source. It's been upgraded in version 0.3. So the new way to do it is, rather than using ORM config, is to use the data source object. So Oh, and one thing I should note is we're going to want to build this in the project itself, because our auth folder is going to have the connection to the database, but the other microservices we create might not necessarily have the same connection. So we're going to have a different database in, some of the different services. So in this auth folder here, I'm going to put it in source as well, because when we build the file, it builds everything in from here. And we're actually going to need that because we're going to have our migrations in here, and also the bundle source. So we'll see that in a moment. It all makes sense soon. So basically we can have this folder here, and we're going to call it migrations. Actually, we're going to call it, let's see here. Let's rename that to database. We're going to generate a migrations folder in here, and we'll do that programmatically. But another thing we're going to have in here is the data source, which is nothing more than the configuration. And this file name is just based on the TypeORM documentation. So let's come to our auth module. And it's going to change a little bit, but not too much. So basically this object here is what we want. So let's copy this. And we can go ahead and we can just export something here. So we just want to export the data source options. And it's called this because the type is the data source options type. And we can go ahead and we can just set that equal to this object here. Now, okay. So let's just save that for a second. Just to get rid of that error or false error. Basically, we're going to be using the Postgres database as before. Now, we're not going to have access to the config service, but what we can do is we can access the environment variables by saying process.env dot the variable that we're looking for. So that's the Postgres URI. Postgres URI. So we can actually leave this in the other location. And then synchronize, we're going to turn off. So basically what we want to do here is this is where we're wanting to define our entities. So whenever we create an entity, we want to define it in here. Now you can also do this using like dir name and all the dist folders and stuff like that. But this is just going to be an example of how we can do this, and then we'll probably switch back over to the development mode. And then, because I get a lot of questions on some of my previous videos, like people had concerns about migrations and stuff like that, and it seems odd that it doesn't get covered earlier in the series. The reasoning is not when you're learning about NestJS, unlike other frameworks, it tends to be a topic that's sort of skipped over until you get into the actual TypeORM specific stuff. So it's more of a ORM specific thing rather than a NestJS specific thing. And that's why in the documentation in NestJS, if you're going through the docs, you don't really see it until you get to some more advanced stuff, which then just references you to the ORM documentation pretty much. But it's really important to cover because one of the most important things about creating systems and having APIs and databases is making sure that your database, its data is up to date and it's not overwritten and it's preserved and all that sort of stuff. So I thought it was a really important topic, so I just still wanted to cover it here. So then we can have our migrations folder. Now this is where that NestCLI changing the Webpack to false comes in handy, because instead of it bundling just one file for each of them. It's going to bundle all of our files, and it's going to basically be a mirror of what our code base looks like in here. So it's going to have this data source file, for example, but it's also going to have the JavaScript, and that's what TypeORM needs to be able to actually make the migration, is the JavaScript file. So basically, because we're running microservices, you can see that like we've got this dist apps thing. So it means the output file of our migrations, and we haven't actually created the migrations yet, but they will go into this file, and we'll prove that in just a moment. So it's going to go into the dist apps, and we're going to be making migrations from the auth folder. And this is where currently the data source is. We can see that we're in the auth, in the source of the auth, but the source doesn't get output into, the source folder doesn't get output into the dist folder, but this DB folder will. And we're going to have another folder which is going to get auto-generated for us called migrations, and we're going to have a star because the migration could be called anything, and then we're going to save this file. So I think this will make a little bit more sense if we actually start to go into some of the scripts that we're going to run. But before we do that, let's just go ahead and export this data source. And with the new TypeORM, you can actually just call the new data source method, and then just pass in those data source options here. So we can just go ahead and we can just save that there. And then we can come into our auth module. And basically we can comment out this stuff here. And yeah, let's just comment this out here, because we might add it back in when we're doing development. But let's say we're doing some production stuff here. We can once again use the useFactory method. And we don't need to worry about the config service at the moment. But we can just reference the data source that we just created. So the data source options we've exported. So this is pretty much the exact same thing, except we've just moved it into another file, and then we've also added this particular entity and where these migrations are going to go to. And we'll see why we've done this when we create our script, but basically we can just make sure things are still working as before. And we can just chuck in this auto load entities to help find any of those sorts of things. What happened there? Control V. So let's just go ahead and we can put this here, and then we can save that. So I think the final piece to the puzzle here is basically going into our package.json scripts. So if we go into our package.json scripts, so let's just minimize everything here. We can see that we've got this build script here, and that was just building it as it was before. But we want to have some more specific things that we're doing. So let's just get rid of that script there. And let's come down to the last script here. And let's start to build up some of these scripts. So we want to be able to build both projects, but we might want to do them independent of one another. So we don't necessarily want to build both every single time. We might, but we can just have this build API script here. And this will essentially just be using the Nest CLI to build it, but specifically for the API. And then we can go ahead and we can have another one here where it's build auth, which will build our auth folder or project. And that's just going to be nest build auth. And then we can also have our build here, which is the npm run build API. But it will also be the npm run build auth script that we just created. So essentially a similar thing, but we can break it down into the different microservices. So the next thing we want to do is we want to have a script to be able to reference the data source. So let me just build this just to show you what's happening here. If I just open up this here, if I run npm run build, you can see that it's running the API and it's building those two commands that we've just put there. And we can see that it's created this dis folder. And now this time we can see that it has all of the JS files. So if I look at the auth folder, we see that we've got our entity, our user entity.js file here. And we need it to be in the JS format for our migrations to occur. And then we've also got this database here, and the data source is in JavaScript, and that's also going to be needed here. So basically what we can do is the data source, recall, that's how we're connecting to the database. And you need to be able to be connected to the database to be able to migrate or change some columns or something in the database. So we can have this script here called TypeORM. And this is going to be used in conjunction with some other scripts. And basically we can just run npx TypeORM. And I'm choosing npx TypeORM because you might not have TypeORM on your system. And since we're using Docker and, we could do a global command, but I think it's easy if we just do npx TypeORM. And then there's this -d flag here. And what this does is it allows us to specify where we want the where we want the data source file to be located from. So we're in the root of the project. So from the root of the project, we want to go into the dis folder. We want to go into the apps folder. We want to go into the auth folder. We want to go into the db folder. And we want to go into the data source.js. And you can see here that this is essentially our TypeScript file got compiled down, but it still has the connection here. And it also tells us where the migrations are going to go. So that's good because we're going to need to do that to perform any of our migrations. So basically what we can have here is we can have another command. And note, this is specific. If we have, right now we've only got the auth folder that's connected. So we could even call this something like auth TypeORM or something like that. But if we were to have other services that also access the same database, for example, but for us, for our purposes, I think it's sufficient if we just call it something like TypeORM. So we can also, there's three main commands. There's a command to generate a migration, and generating a migration creates the SQL for us basically. And then there's another command to run the SQL, so it actually makes the migration. And then there's a third command to revert the migration. So that just reverts the last migration that got run. So let's just have generate migration as a command here. And this is just going to use the TypeORM command because it's going to need that connection. And then it has this -- space syntax. And then the TypeORM command itself is actually called migration : generate. So we can come here, and we can also have another command here where it's run migration. And of course, if you wanted to, you could put this build by having an npm run build and this command here if you want. That'll ensure it builds every time before doing it. But if it's already built, for example, you'll have to rebuild, and that can take like 10-15 seconds. So I'm just going to do it manually. But that's up to you, of course. Run migration. You can have a npm run TypeORM to get all the details again. And then once again, we can have the migration run command. And the final one here is the revert migration command. So what we'll have here is we'll have, once again, npm run TypeORM -- migration revert. And we can save that. So the key thing to note here is that we need to build our project first, because when we build our project, we generate the dist folder. And then in the dist folder, it has our data source JavaScript file. And that's what's going to be needed to make our connection to the database, which TypeORM needs to be able to run migrations or generate or revert migrations. And then we can see that, so that's how that works here. And another thing to note is when we build our project, in addition to the data source here, we also have our entity file here. So if we come to let's come to the TypeScript file, technically we could do a similar thing where we're pointing to it with the wildcard here if we chose to do so. But the important thing to note is we've turned off synchronize. That means when we start things up for the first time, basically the code shouldn't work because we haven't actually synchronized. We haven't made the changes. And if you're still wondering where this file comes from, we're actually going to write this in the command when we generate our migrations. And I'm going to do that in the Docker container. So let's go ahead and we can run our application here. So I think what we should do is we should run a Docker compose up. And we've done a lot of config stuff. So I'm just going to tack on this build here. Sometimes you might need to clear your volumes and images and stuff like that. So I'm just going to give this a shot because I've just added a new volume in. But if you already had a volume from before, you might want to use like Docker prune or something like that, Docker volume prune, or Docker remove to remove your containers, commands like that. So this should actually not work, but we can see, well, we can see now that in our data, all of our Postgres stuff has been bound to our host machine here. So that's all well and good. So what I want to do is I want to go into the container itself, and you can run docker exec as well. But we are in this auth thing here. And we're getting this unable to connect to the database. And that kind of makes sense because we haven't actually created the database because we didn't save the volume from before. So what we can do is we can actually go into the, where is it? The CLI, into the terminal. And we can just go ahead and we can run a command. So we just created the npm generate migration command. So let's run an npm run generate migration. So let's just have a look at that just to remind ourselves of what that is. The generate migration, it's going to connect with our details to Postgres, which will allow us to make TypeORM connection based on the data source. And then we can run the migration generate command. And the way that works is it basically looks at the database, and then it looks at our entity files. And if there's any differences, it will create the SQL for us to make the differences that we've done in our code reflect in the migration file in which we can run. So basically the location it needs is that location, this location here. So that's where that missing piece of the puzzle comes in. So basically, if we come back into our Docker container, we can add in the --, and then we can go into our apps folder, into the auth folder, into the source folder, into the DB folder, into the migrations folder, and we can call this whatever we want. We might call this initdb, for example. So we can go ahead and click enter here. And we can see here that it's successfully generated a migration for us, which is awesome. So we can come into Visual Studio Code to see that. And we can actually, where is it? In our apps folder, in the auth folder, in the source folder, in the DB folder, it's created this migrations folder here for us. And note that this is in TypeScript. So when we build the folder, so let's actually go ahead and build it. Let's see here. Actually, let's just close this just for a second here. Actually, we turned the Docker ignore off, so we might not even need to with the hot reloading. What's going on here though? Well, all right, let's just turn it off. As you might see, I'm on a Mac at the moment, and I'm usually on a Windows, so I don't know all the hotkeys that well. So I'm just going to go ahead and terminate that. But the important thing to note is we've generated this file here, and basically what it does is it takes the name of whatever you called it. So I've called this initdb, and then it takes the timestamp. So this is the number of milliseconds since Unix time, I'm pretty sure. And that just means if you do another migration with the same name, that you'll get the unique migration. And if you look at this, if you know SQL, you can see that what it's doing is it's actually creating the user table for us. And it's having the ID and first name here. And as you saw in our entity file, that is exactly what our table should look like. So what I want to do here is I want to just run an npm run build. So I'm going to run that again. And actually I might do a docker compose down just to make sure that that's down. So what I can do is I can have a look at the dist folder, look at the auth folder, look at the DB, look at the migrations, and you can see that we've actually got the JavaScript migrations now. And there's two of them. There's a JavaScript and a JavaScript map one. And the reason we've done all of this stuff is because we needed that JavaScript file to do the TypeORM migration. So let's start up our Docker Compose again. So let's run a Docker Compose up. Now you probably might not even need to do that if you can open another terminal up, unlike myself. But basically I also wanted to show you the dist folder there. And the important note is that we've created this migration here. So we have this in our code. We are getting a couple of errors because we still need to run the migration. So let's go ahead and do that. And if we open up Docker here, and we open up our container here, and we open up our CLI, our terminal, and I can run the npm run migration command. That's going to look at all of the migrations, because I think what happens is in our Postgres database, it actually creates a migration table. So whenever we run that, generate migration command, it adds it to the table. And then if there's nothing, if some of those migrations aren't dealt with when we run this command, it puts a flag to it has been run or something like that. So that's how it's able to know how to do the migrations. And we can see that we've created this table here. So what that means is we should be able to make API calls. So yeah, that works. So there's nothing in there because we only bound the volume after. But let's go ahead and just create something here. So we can see we've got Larry with the ID of 1, Larry with the ID of 2. And then we can see that we've got that there. And then what we want to do is let's just go ahead and do something. So let's come into our code here. And actually I want to show that we can survive container shutdowns as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a Control-C to stop this because we need to demonstrate that, a database data doesn't disappear. So I'm just going to run Docker Compose down. Not sure if that's strictly necessary or if it already is down. But nevertheless, what we'll do here is let's go into our user entity and let's just change it back to name, for example. So we'll change that to name, which means in the service, we need to change it to name. And let's just have a different name here of Barry. And then we'll save that. So let's just run the npm run build command. And then once again, let's run our Docker Compose up. So having it this way, there's a little bit of effort, building the project and all that. We could definitely streamline this a lot better. But this is more just how to demonstrate how to do migrations in NestJS with TypeORM in a microservice-based architecture, because it is slightly different to the regular thing. And because the TypeORM 0.3 is so new, there's really not too much information on this topic. So I thought it'd be good to cover. But we will probably go ahead and do this. This is something we'll do like not in development mode because of the extra effort involved with it. But let's just check that things are working okay. So I've run this, so let's run this here. Okay, so we get an API error, internal server error. That's because we haven't updated our code. We haven't made the migration. So let's come in here, and then once again we can run the npm run generate migration, and that's going to be from the apps folder, in the auth folder, in the source folder, in the db folder, in the migrations folder, and we're just going to call this second migration, for example, here. Now, I'm not sure if I actually have to. Oh, we'll have to build this again. So let's just see what this looks like here. So I think a better way to do this is to have like perhaps the build command in the Docker file, for example. Actually, maybe it is. So let's have a little look here. So we're in the Docker container here. CD. So let's CD into the dis folder, CD into the apps folder, CD into the auth folder. Let's CD into the actually let's go back one. ls. Actually, where did I put this? I think it's going to be easy just to turn off and on again. So that's that. Where's the data source? This apps auth db migrations. What does it say in us? Okay, so let's cd into auth, cd into db, ls, cd into migrations, ls. Okay, so we actually got it in there. That's good. So that means we don't have to rebuild, as I showed before. We can actually just go ahead and we can do an npm run migration. And we can see that that's changed the first name to name. So let's have a look if that is true. So let's go into Postman here. And let's run this. And then we can see we've got Larry, and rather than first name, we've got name. So that's actually better than I thought it was going to be. And then let's just add something in here. So then we've got Barry as well. And we see we've got Larry, Barry. Okay, that's great because we've seen that we're able to persist data with bind mounts and survive container shutdowns. We're also able to do migrations, and we're able to do that without stopping the container and doing it in the container itself. And we've seen how to do this in the microservices architecture with the new TypeORM data source. So I think to finish up, I just want to sort of revert back to the development mode, but it was really, really important to cover this topic because most people are building applications for production. It's a topic that gets missed quite a lot, and covering it here, it's really important to do that. So we have the knowledge of how to do that in the future. But as you see, there was a little bit of extra steps involved in doing that. It's probably going to be easier if we just go ahead and use the regular synchronize true. So I think actually this stuff can be similar. And then I'll just have this command here like this. Control C, Control V, and then I'll just go ahead and I'll just save this. And then if I go ahead and come into here, maybe I'll make this last name, for example, and I save that. And then I change this to last name as well. And I save that. Let's see what that does. So let's go into Postman here and run the API call. And we can see that it automatically synchronized that for us. So we're going to continue to use that auto synchronization for development mode. But again, it was really important to cover that, how to actually do migrations. And in the next video, we're going to explore authentication in the microservice architecture using JSON Web Tokens. And we're going to do that in the back end with NestJS. And then we're going to start to work on the React Native front end as well in the video following that. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.